Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. It's Monday, January 15th, 2018, and I'm really happy to be back in the saddle after our long winter's break. And I am here, as I often am, with Corey DeVos, Editor-in-Chief of Integral Life. Hey, Corey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great, man. Super psyched to be back.
Yeah, me too. I hope you all had a good holiday. Corey and I spent a good bit of it together, actually. We were at the What Now conference at the hotel here outside of Boulder. And we had a couple hundred people here in to talk about, the world as it is unfolding. And it was a great conference. There's just some X factor about being with people who are flying at the integral altitude. And it's, I talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the conference, and I was thinking just how special it is, to be seen and see other people and just have this sort of, built-in understanding. And I was thinking how special it is, but then I was sort of reminded that that's how I felt when I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal savior and hung around people who had done the same. And, it's, maybe it's no better, but it's definitely bigger because we include more. And that is, so it's so fun. And Corey, you were saying that you did a roundup of the key ideas of the conference with Keith Witt on Saturday?
Yeah, on Saturday we did one of Keith's Live with Dr. Keith calls, and we surfaced a lot of sort of the more prominent themes that emerged. And, we're basically talking about how, whenever you do an integral conference, you sort of have to try to touch all parts of the elephant, and it's a really, really big elephant, which can, make these conferences a bit complicated. But I think we did a pretty good job of threading the needle and kind of tying together all these different, patterns of disruption, both in the exterior world and in the interior world, and, coming up with strategies of resilience and all that. I think it was great. I agree with you that the crowd was really wonderful, and there's just something sort of alchemical that happens when you get, these folks into a room together. It's, and it's not like, we integral people, we're a very diverse group, and we bring a lot of different perspectives into the room. But what's, I think, sort of amazing about it is everyone's capacity to hang with each other's perspective, to actually take it on, and to see the world through each other's eyes, which is, I think comes a little bit more easily for the integral mind than it does for, sort of previous stages. So it was electric.
They don't call it flex flow for nothing.
That's right.
So we rang in the new year together. It was over New Year's. If you, I guess, consider going to bed at 10:30, ringing in the new year, which is what I did. But anyway, it's good to be in this new year, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit. I was just thinking about, the new year, and how a couple years ago I did a show on how I think it was 2016 was the best year in history, and I get my share of eye rolls and scorn for that kind of a thesis. But, I maintain it's true. I mean, from the broadest perspective, which is what we're going for at Integral, a global perspective, one that takes human history into account, it's pretty much undeniable. And I'll get to some of the reasons in a minute. But I do notice that last year I didn't do that theme because I'll grant you it's harder to make that case the year that Trump was elected. Even though I do think that, as I've made this case in many of these past episodes, if we survive him, we'll be a better people for having endured him. But here we are, ending 2017, opening 2018. It's the first year anniversary of the Trump presidency. We're all still intact, apparently, with some exceptions. And I'm gonna wade back into the human progress waters here a little bit, and part of why I have, excuse me, part of why I have the courage to do that is that I'm noticing that more and more people in the cutting edge of the intelligentsia, if you will, the punditry and so forth, and even people I know, are able to sort of hold this idea of progress in a way that has been, difficult when we were more green, if you will. And I use a couple examples of this. One of them was a column by Nick Kristof, who is one of the most liberal columnists in the New York Times. And I actually think Nick Kristof is very integral. He's always traveling around the world to these hot spots with refugees and genital mutilation and all of the horror stories of what's going on in the world. And yet he wrote a column over New Year's in the New York Times called "Why 2017 Was the Best Year in Human History." And I was like, wow, Nicholas Kristof too. And here's just a few lines from that column. He said, "We need some perspective as we watch the circus in Washington with our hands over our mouths in horror." He goes on to say, "Every day, the number of people around the world living in extreme poverty, that is less than $2 a day, goes down by 217,000, according to calculations by Max Roser, an Oxford University economist who runs a website called Our World in Data, which is a fascinating, went there to the website, Our World in Data, Oxford University. He points out, in addition to the 217,000 who come out of extreme poverty every day, there's an additional 325,000 more people gain access to electricity, and 300,000 people gain access to clean drinking water. That's 3 times the size of Boulder County every day. He goes on to say, as recently as the 1960s, a majority of humans had always been illiterate and lived in extreme poverty. In another 15 years from now, illiteracy and extreme poverty will be mostly gone. After thousands of generations, they are pretty much disappearing on our watch. And he goes on to make various cases and so forth. But, at the end of the column, I sort of got a kick out of it because he sort of had to apologize to his readers a little bit for having this point of view, for bringing it forward. And so he writes at the end, "Granted, this column may feel weird to you, because he knows who his audience is. They're the readers of the editorial page of the New York Times, like me, a lot of people who are waist deep in green." And then he, at the end of the column, he promises, he says, "Every other day this year, I promise to tear my hair out and weep and scream in outrage at all the things going wrong." So, I said, all is well at the end. I also noticed a column by Andrew Sullivan, who is, I miss very much. I mean, Andrew used to do the Daily Dish, and me and my friends would read it all day, every day, and, forward things from him. And he's a great intellectual, in my opinion. He gets a hysterical every so often, but I really find him well worth reading. So anyway, he writes a column in New York Magazine called "Trump's First Year Has Been a Disaster, and Here's Why I Have Hope." And so the first few paragraphs are about the disaster part. He talks about the White House is a smoldering crater of chaos and dysfunction. We have record levels of social and economic inequality, unprecedented peacetime debt, massive transfer of wealth to the very rich, funded through an increase in the national debt of close to $1 trillion. It's talking about the latest tax bill, experiencing the first catastrophes of an era of climate change. And he ends the paragraph with, "Oh, and Neil Gorsuch." Now, you can argue with any of this if you want, but it establishes his, liberal base with the readers of New York Magazine. It's what they have in common. And that's fair enough. But he then follows all of that by saying that many other indicators in the world are remarkably good right now. Economic growth is ubiquitous in the developed world, including even Japan, for the first time in quite a while. In America, we are in a record 8th year of economic growth, bringing peak employment and finally a bump in earnings. Median household income is now at the highest in history. The Dow is at 25,000. Medicine has effectively abolished most of the diseases which used to kill us in mass numbers. Illegal border crossings to the US have fallen to record lows. More Americans have health insurance than at any point in history, and Trump has failed to kill Obamacare. Crime rates are at historic lows and keep declining in ways that simply baffle criminologists. Hang on, let me turn this off. Solar energy is finally competitive with fossil fuels. Global conflict continues its long centuries-old decline. ISIS has been destroyed in its own heartland. Anyone with a phone has access to more learning and knowledge than at any point in human history. More people live in democracies today than a dozen years ago. And when natural disasters happen, they kill fewer people in a far more populous world. The last decade has seen the biggest decline in global poverty ever, and on, he writes. And it does go on and on. I mean, whether it's electricity or calories or communication or internet, sanitation, disease, people are, from again, that global historic perspective, living better than ever before. But of course, is this how people feel? No. 90% of the people in the United States say that global poverty is getting worse or staying the same. The Washington Post did a survey of Americans to see what word they would use to describe 2017, the year just ending. Number 1, chaos, chaotic. Number 2, crazy. Number 3, challenging. Number 4, great. We finally got a positive word. The word great, and this probably is the Trumpsters. The 5th most common word to describe 2017, tumultuous, turbulent. Number 6, horrendous/horrid. Number 7, disappointing. Number 8, interesting, and we all know what interesting means. Disastrous is number 9, and again, a good one at the end, good is number 10. And of course, this is a well-established dimension or characteristic of the human psyche, is that we have what psychologists call negativity bias, which is that we're tuned to figure out what's wrong. And of course, that's evolutionarily appropriate. There's the, classic old saw about, the person who's just chilling out and watching Netflix in the old caveman days is the one who's most likely to get eaten by the tiger. The one who's a neurotic mess and looking around and can't sleep and anxious is the one who's most likely to see it. So that is appropriate. And we have that, built in. And as Kristof said in his article, he said, "We journalists focus on bad news. We cover planes that crash, not those that take off. But the backdrop of global progress may be the most important development in our lifetimes." And I think that's true. He notes that there was never a headline saying, "The Industrial Revolution is happening," even though that was the most important news of the last 250 years. And I would argue that we are in the middle of a consciousness revolution that is as important and consequential as the Industrial Revolution. And it's happening right now, and we can see it. And we can, and part of it is that especially as we move into integral territory where we begin to see the movement of evolution in history, and even the movement of evolution in ourselves, we can see these big moves that we ourselves have made, that at red we get powerful and we leave mother and we go out into the world. At amber, traditionalism. We get civilized. We learn how to sit down in a row and raise our hand and answer questions. And we become far less violent at traditionalism, even though, historically, traditional societies are violent and compared to the next stage, which is orange, rational. Green, we become sensitive. At integral, we have a flex flow that allows us to actually partake of the gifts of all previous stages and to hold them in a bigger, more open, flexible space. And I go back to this, the line from Andrew Sullivan's column where he said that, and I see this all over the place, and it's often in similar language. He said, crime rates are at historic lows and keep declining in ways that simply baffle criminologists. And I don't know if many of you may have seen the statistics out of New York City where the crime rate, I forget the numbers, but they shocked even me at how low the crime rate is. And also considering that they stopped the stop and frisk program a couple of years ago, that crime rate just continues to fall and far less Black men are incarcerated as a result. So very good, getting smarter here. So, that criminologists are baffled. To me, at least my pet theory is we're just getting more conscious. People at all strata are still plugged in to this mediaverse where we see other perspectives, we see other people, we watch these little morality plays on television called sitcoms, whatever. We're just we're soaking in a modern and postmodern view, and that is just, violence doesn't make sense at that stage. It's not the best way forward. Previous to those stages, it actually was the best way forward. You'd go take what you wanted. So, there's just these modern sensibilities are coming online in all kinds of ways. There was a headline in the New York Times the other day talking about the country of Wales. And the headline was, Wales moves towards ban on slapping as discipline for kids. And it talked about how Wales is soon to follow Scotland in joining now 50 countries who ban physical punishment of children. And of course, there's always, the other side. There's the movement called the Be Reasonable movement that opposes these laws, saying that it criminalizes parenting. But fair enough. I mean, the traditionalists still sort of think that it's okay. And then there's the people who are ambivalent in between and sort of have a foot in modernity and a foot in traditionalism. And my dad was one of those people. And I can remember when I was probably 8 or 9, and I don't remember what I had done, but my mother was all upset with me. And it was when my dad got home from work, I was going to get a spanking. And so, we waited for my dad to get home from work, and she told him, and I had to go get a spanking. And so we went into my room, and he looked at me, and it was pathetic. He actually said to me, "This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you." And I can remember very clearly that moment. We had this eye contact, and I said to him, "Yeah, right." We sort of had a little laugh. There was something about it that was a little bit funny. And then, and then ensued the most pathetic spanking ever given a child in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania to that point. I mean, it was a pantomime of spanking. I actually felt sorry for him. And I realize now it did hurt him more than it hurt me. And so this is just the natural, civilization process. And yet it's often misunderstood. I pointed out in past episodes, one of them was the Maureen Dowd column on the Sandusky and the child abuse in Penn State, and the little kid in the shower and so forth, and her column about how this is about the degeneration of our society. And I think I even played a segment from Morning Joe where Mike Barnacle was talking about the Harvey Weinstein, the Me Too movement, this awareness around sexual harassment as more proof of the degradation of society, when actually it's the exact opposite. It's, all of history, children were abused, and often sexually. Women were certainly subjugated and harassed. And even though it's unpleasant, this lancing, this shining light on these situations is fundamental progress. But, all first tier memes, that is from archaic up to postmodern, all 6 of those what we call first tier memes of development, those stages of development, they all have some story about human beings falling from paradise, and that we have done it, we've disobeyed, we have to be punished, we have done it wrong, we've driven it into a ditch, and if you listen to me, maybe we can find our way out of it. And every stage has their, solution to the problem. So, what I'm seeing in the culture, and I'm happy to see this, is more of an integral view where we're able to hold both, where we can see what's wrong, and we can definitely feel into the abject suffering that still is going on in the world, that is as abject as it ever was in certain situations, a vanishing point, but still there. And yet still see the movement of goodness, truth, and beauty as it unfolds through these, ever evolving stages of development. So, green still has that, dystopian view. And it's not just developmental. I think it's also typological. I think there are some people, even at integral stages, who have, maybe it's residual green, we all have that, of course, or residual first tier, but it's also just, their enneatype or how they're sort of wired. And I had an experience of this the other night. I had my friends, Bob and Michelle, over for dinner, and we were having a nice dinner, the 4 of us. And we were talking about how, kids today, that they're going to live to be 150. And, somebody put that out, and it was, we all think there's some truth to that, 120, 150, whatever it is. And I remember thinking, and as that was said, that, and I was just wrapping my lips around the words, I wonder what cool new things these kids are going to experience. And before I could get the words out, Bob said, wow, I wonder what cataclysms these kids are going to have to experience. And it's just, that quick where our minds went. And, takes all sorts to make the world, but it's, it's a habit of thought that I'm probably as guilty of as he is. And, it's, there was a quote from Adam Smith, writing in the 1700s about pessimism. And he said that pessimists have always been ubiquitous and have always been feted. They've always been celebrated. 5 years have seldom passed away in which some book or pamphlet has not been published pretending to demonstrate that the wealth of nations was fast declining, that the country was depopulated, agriculture neglected, manufacturing decaying, and trade undone. And that is certainly, my experience. I was an apocalyptic for the first 25 years of my life until I found Integral, maybe a few years after that. But, it was the population bomb. I remember being terrified about that. Killer bees, acid rain, Ebola, mad cow, a bird flu, all these plagues. Y2K was the king of them all. And all of them, solemnly espoused by distinguished, sober experts and hysterically echoed in the media. And we still have it. And the apocalypse of our time is a climate change in the environment. And let me just say that I think a lot of it's true, and that I support every environmental policy I've ever heard of. But, you can, I've got some crisis fatigue, I'm a recovering apocalyptic at this point. And so I don't want to be frightened into action anymore. That's one of the moves we talk about, that the difference between first tier, those first 6 stages, and second tier, starting with the integral, teal, turquoise, and so forth, is that we move from, and this is Claire Graves' original research into this, we move from deficiency needs, or the idea that something's deficient or wrong and has to be fixed. That's first tier. To, in second tier, what he calls being needs, or the sense that we actually want to contribute, we want to create, we want to love. And so, we move from a fear operating system to a love operating system. And where we act, and it's not, I find pessimism and optimism to be, very inadequate words. It's not, I don't feel particularly optimistic. I think a lot can go wrong. A lot is going wrong. But I think things going wrong is part of the way forward. That's just, that's built into the system. And I don't necessarily approve of that, but I wasn't consulted when the universe was being created. And so, this seems to be the way it is. We sort of fail and fight, and the other F word, our way forward. And it's beautiful, but not pretty, as I often say. And I do think that there's an imperative, that there's a moral calling for those of us who are integral practitioners to really challenge our fear stories and challenge how we're using fear. I mean, I actually think that using fear with first tier people is still useful because first tier responds to it. I mean, it's sort of a moral dilemma in a way, but it also, I think, leads to a lot of bad policy. When we think about climate change and the real dangers of climate change, it's disheartening that it's so far down the list of concerns for everybody except postmodernists, except for green, 30%. There's a statistic I saw where 58% of those in Britain who voted to leave the EU at Brexit, the 58% of those people who wanted to leave the EU say that life is worse today than it was 30 years ago. So that's certainly true for the Trumpsters and the Make America Great Again. I mean, it's an explicit call to, go back and to some 1950s era or whatever somebody thinks when America was greater than it is now. And, as Kristof said in his article in the New York Times, he said, in the 1950s, the US had segregation, polio, and bans on interracial marriage. Bans also on gay sex and birth control. Most of the world lived under dictatorships. 2/3 of parents had a child die before the age of 5. Let me read that again. Again, this is a global statistic. 2/3 of parents had a child die before the age of 5 in the 1950s. It was a time of nuclear standoffs, of pea soup smog, of frequent wars, of stifling limits on women, and of the worst famines in history. So, we actually don't want to go back there. What I think can come forward into an integral understanding of progress is that, it's not like suffering really goes anywhere. It transforms. There's a truth. There's a basic truth to suffering. It's the first noble truth of Buddhism, that life is suffering, that life is dukkha, that, I always love what Trungpa said. Chogyam Trungpa said that, he's not sure that suffering was the best translation of dukkha, that it's basically, for at least for our sensibilities in our world, it's a sense of dissatisfactoriness, unsatisfactoriness, that things aren't the way they should be, that something's wrong. And, that continues. But here's how it continues. And I think this is really a helpful way of looking at it is, for the most part, we're moving out of gross suffering. You know, in Integral, we talk about how we live in three great states of being: the gross state, that is our physical state. We live in the subtle realm, which is the realm of thought and argument and ideas and so forth. And then we live in the causal realm, which is the more spiritual, which actually sort of, you know, dissolves into the absolute reality. And that what we can notice is that gross state suffering is what's really coming to an end. The idea of starvation, violence, women dying, babies dying in childbirth, disease, all of that is, you know, we still have to die, but that, you know, abject suffering of the physical state is what's diminishing radically. But what is not decreasing, and maybe even is increasing in a certain way and in certain flavors, is the suffering in the subtle realm. And, you know, the alienation and isolation and anxiety. I'm reading about these, you know, how the incidence of depression and anxiety among teenagers, and it's really heartbreaking to me. And I sort of get it, you know, because it's a confusing world. It's so big, the virtual world, the real world. I think a lot of it's just that we have the time and leisure, if you will. I mean, we're not out looking for calories to actually look at our internal state for the first time and realize, eesh, you know, I'm going to die. I mean, this is an unsatisfactory world. And so that is the flavor and nature of suffering when we get to the modern world and postmodern world: anxiety and depression, alienation, isolation. Is that preferable to existential fear, that there is a real enemy on the other side of the Flatirons here in Boulder, or that, you know, and they're about to strike tonight? That's how humans lived for many millennia. Natural disasters, a drought was deadly, a flood, disease, the beasts of the forest. That we don't have to worry about them anymore, or at least in the same way. Is that better? I'd say, yeah. I mean, I'll take you know, the anxiety and depression over getting my throat ripped out. But it's still suffering. And so there is something true about that as we move forward. There's that sort of lost innocence. And, you know, that's worth noting and feeling. And we're not trying to explain that away or ignore it, but just sort of embrace it. And that's one of the things that happens in Integral in general, is that we stop being afraid of fear. We actually, in suffering, we actually want to turn towards it, because we can see that, you know, allowing it in and seeing it is actually the means of metabolizing it. And so there you go. I think it's worth contemplating as a thought experiment, at least, that we are living in an ever brightening world, and that everything's okay. And that, yes, we're going to die, but as we move into the integral stages of development, we start to identify with the transpersonal dimensions of our identity that actually don't die. And that's a topic for another discussion, but it's worth noting. All right, folks. Well, thank you for listening. And Corey, any thoughts from you, my friend?
Yeah, I got a few thoughts. First off, that was gorgeous. And this is you know, one of the major reasons I'm so excited that the show is back. Because, you know, I think what you're demonstrating here, Jeff, is, you know, when we're talking about integral and we're talking about sort of the utility that integral can serve in the world, you know, I think people's first response is, you know, we got to teach everyone aqua. We got to drop a bunch of quadrants and stages and, you know, on people's heads. And
that's important.
Yeah, it absolutely is. The cognitive aspect.
No, it totally is. Yeah.
Terribly important.
Yeah.
But I think what you're demonstrating here is actually more important, which is sort of the intrinsic qualities and contours of the integral mind, and how that can actually help us through what I think we would agree is a tumultuous period right now. We're in this transitional phase, and I don't think anyone really knows what we're transitioning into, but something is happening. The state of matter is starting to change. We're going from, I don't know, solid to liquid or something. And I think what you're offering here is, Integral has, I think, a certain sort of feature set that really helps with this. I mean, one being, sort of a acknowledgement, a recognition of the evolutionary arc of the universe and of the world that we live in. In other words, history is a shithole. And we're slowly climbing out of that shithole a little bit more year by year, month by month, day by day.
Yeah.
And, Integral, I think, gives us sort of the framing that we need in order to actually see and appreciate, which gives us that wider view, right? And also along with it gives us, a couple other tools. It offers us discernment, where we can actually constellate any number of, seemingly antagonistic views, which actually, we're able to see from sort of another purview. These aren't antagonistic views. They're true or partial and can be unfolded in some, really interesting ways. I think that having the systemic awareness that, like, yeah, the Americans, there's dozens of American systems that are very tumultuous right now and are changing either rapidly or not rapidly enough in response to, our ever-changing life conditions surrounding us. And that creates pain, that creates suffering. It also creates opportunity and all of that. But the integral mind is able to sort of see how these systems are surrounded by enmeshed with, enveloped by any number of other systems. So, you're talking about earlier about the population bomb. Well, one of the things that we're learning is as we civilize more and more and have more and more access to wealth, as more people move into some, analog of the middle class, whatever that might mean in these various economies, people start having fewer kids, which is sort of ironic. Once you can afford having more kids, you stop having more kids. And it's, again, there's these, we love.
No, it's completely unexpected. And that's the beauty of evolution, is that, and it's also the source of a lot of the sort of apocalypse that I talked about, is that people see trends and they just extrapolate them into the future. Well,
that's right.
Things don't move in the future that way.
Things
morph and transform. They don't just grow.
Yep.
And something new comes out of that's completely unexpected. Who in the traditional world would have ever expected rationality would be next?
Right.
Who in the rational world would ever expect that the next stage would be, we're all going to become nice?
Yep.
It's
that's right. That's right.
But we have enough history behind us now that we could see those patterns, and that the seeing of those patterns is one of the main entrees into integral consciousness, because all of a sudden it's not static. It's not just this, one goddamn thing after the next.
That's right.
It's actually growing, developing, and yes, we lose innocence, and yes, there's something about the sparkle of a child that is sad to see, the difference between a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old sometimes, or a 23-year-old. But, again, beautiful but not pretty.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and, I think a lot of that apocalyptic energy, at least for, modernity and above, a lot of that comes from sort of a sort of initial capacity to see systems. So if you're only focusing on one or two systems at a time, let that be the economic system, the political system, whatever it might be, it's a lot easier to fall into that apocalyptic mindset, because entropy acts on all systems, and all systems will invariably change or terminate or what have you. But if you have the sort of systemic discernment to see all the other systems that are intermeshed and enveloping whatever, your sort of pet system that you like to, sort of rant about, as soon as you plug that into sort of everything else that's emerging in the world, it gets a little bit less terrifying, because these systems do, as you were saying earlier, we have a tendency to look for negatives. And as a result, we look for negative feedback loops among these systems. What we often don't see are the positive feedback loops. Yeah. So I think that lower right sort of systemic discernment is important. And then up in the upper left, there's this natural not just a natural capacity to take perspective, but a natural curiosity where you actually want to take someone else's perspective.
Yeah.
And that opens up these channels of empathy, I think. And those channels of empathy.
Somebody says something outrageous. It's like, it's not just, how could you say that?
That's right.
It's, how could you say that?
Yeah, that's right. You sort of lean in rather than leaning away.
Yeah, you get curious instead of critical. That's another big move in Integral. It's what you're just talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And then also in the upper left, we have, sort of baked into Integral itself is access to witness consciousness, and the this unshakable mountain within us. This, and then it's reality becomes this ongoing explosion of an unstoppable force hitting an unmovable
play and
subject.
display.
Yeah. And that gives you not only
what
the
a relief. I feel a relief of just seeing that, the display of life.
Yeah.
And know that I'm being lived.
That's right.
It's not just I didn't really screw up as bad as I thought.
Right. Right. And it's sort of, it's that hurts more, bothers you less quality of that state of consciousness, which actually helps prevent us from doing, sort of the spiritual bypassing. Oh, guys, everything's fine. We're all stardust, and, suffering's just an illusion. I mean, that route can be tempting for people, but, I think integral spirituality reminds us, yes, it bothers you less, but my God, does it hurt more?
Yeah.
And, integral tells us that it's because we can see that there is that evolutionary arc to the universe. That's why we need to engage. That's not, and that's an invitation to step further into it, rather than sort of just taking this background, Zen kind of like, oh, we'll just, sort of let everything be as it is. Well, no, this, if you're able to make these discernments, if you're able to see reality self-organizing in these different ways, then you have a responsibility to engage and enact however you can.
And fight and, be ruthless and, whatever's required to make the world a better place. But what you don't have to do is feel like you screwed up, that the humanity screwed up. You don't have to hate people who see it differently. It's so much better.
Yeah, it really is.
Such a relief.
That's right. And Jeff, one of the things, and we don't have to get into it today, but one of the things I've been thinking about that I would love to get into, with you at some point soon, is I've been putting a lot of thought onto, how we communicate with people. Because I want 2018 to be, everyone's talking about this big left wave, blue wave that's coming in. I want to see all that happen. But more importantly, I want to see a re-emergence of shared wisdom in our culture. Right now, I think the left is doing what they can to lay down a new kind of basement floor of shame. What I want to see is that higher wisdom beginning to emerge that actually helps sort of lift us up. And I think one of the paths to that wisdom is finding better ways to communicate with people who don't necessarily agree with you, and finding ways to separate a person's values, particularly ethnocentric values, which are to be included, versus ethnocentric views, which includes things like racism, sexism, xenophobia, all the things that we love to pin on Donald Trump, and probably accurately so. But I think that the liberals fall into the trap of only seeing the views and not recognizing the values. And it's the fact that those values are being underserved and underfed and undernourished that makes those views as toxic as they really are. And that's
well said.
An example of the type of wisdom I want to see emerge over.
And you're right, that's a different discussion.
Yep.
But we'll have it, and it's beautifully laid out there. Views versus values.
Yeah.
Right on.
Overall, buddy, I'm looking forward to taking this journey with you this year. I think this is going to be a fantastic.
We're going to get this thing straightened out.
Yeah. You and me, buddy.
All right. Well, thank you, folks, for joining us, and we'll be back on Wednesday for another edition of the Daily Evolver Live. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.